in old age, learn to be cold. Margaret Whittaker's mornings began with precision. A cup of Earl Grey, steeped exactly 4 minutes, and the Cedar Hollow Gazette spread across her kitchen table. At 78, she'd perfected the art of routine. Her cottage, tucked at the edge of a whispering pine forest, stood like a sentinel against the world's noise. The townsfolk called her the Hermit of Hemlock Lane, a title she wore like armor. She'd learned, decades ago, that warmth invited intrusion, and intrusion, she knew, was a prelude to pain. The uninvited guest. The first crack in her armor came on a brittle autumn afternoon. A knock echoed, 3 sharp raps, as Margaret sorted dahlias in her garden. She glanced up to see a young woman clutching a notebook, her smile too bright, too eager. "Ms. Whittaker, I'm Lila Moore. I write for the Gazette's Voices of Cedar Hollow column. Would you share your story? Folks are curious about, well, you." Margaret stiffened. Curious, a polite word for nosy. She'd spent 30 years dodging Cedar Hollow's whispers about her never-married status, her abrupt return to town after college, the sealed boxes in her attic. She met Lila's gaze, her voice glacial. "No." The reporter faltered. "But your family's history here. Your father was mayor. Your mother founded the library. The past is dead." Margaret snipped a dahlia stem with finality. "Goodbye, Miss Moore. The questions." Cedar Hollow's questions always came disguised as concern. 1. Why don't you ever talk about your brother? At Sunday market, Mrs. Porter from the bakery cornered her, bundling croissants with faux nonchalance. "My Henry says your brother James was a war hero. You must be so proud." Margaret's hands tightened on her cane. James's face flashed in her mind, smirking as he'd boarded the train to Vietnam, never to return. The Army's telegram had called it brave sacrifice. Her parents called it God's will. She'd called it unbearable. "No," she said simply. Mrs. Porter blinked. No, I won't discuss it." She left the croissants on the counter. 2. What really happened with Daniel Hart? Daniel. The name still prickled like frost. At 24, she'd worn his engagement ring, a pear-cut diamond that caught the light as they'd planned a future. Until the night she found the letters, another woman's letters, tucked in his desk. She'd returned the ring in a sealed envelope, fled to Europe, and buried her heart in a Paris museum job. Decades later, Cedar Hollow still gossiped. "You two were the talk of the town," chuckled old Mr. Greeley at the post office. "Why'd you really leave him?" Margaret stared past him, her breath visible in the cold air. "Next in line, please." 3. Aren't you lonely? The worst question came from Father O'Brien, who visited every Christmas with fig pudding and pity. "Margaret, let us bring you meals. Let someone in." She'd wanted to scream that loneliness was safer than betrayal, that her mother's funeral, where friends had jostled for inheritance scraps, had taught her the cost of vulnerability. Instead, she said, "I have my books," and shut the door. The storm. The reckoning arrived in February. A blizzard howled, knocking out power lines. Margaret huddled by the fireplace when pounding shook her door. Lila stood there, shivering, her car stranded in a snowdrift. "Please, just till morning." Against her instincts, Margaret relented. The girl clattered about, peppering her with chatter until, inevitably, the question slipped out. "Why do you push everyone away?" The logs crackled. Margaret traced the scar on her palm, a childhood burn from James's dare. "Tell her," whispered a voice, "what's left to lose." "I had a sister," she said abruptly. Lila froze. "A half-sister, from father's affair. Mother paid her mother to disappear. I found the checks." Her throat tightened. I confronted him. He said, "Coldness keeps this family intact." The next week, he died. I've wondered, was he right? Lila's eyes glistened. "You don't have to be cold with me." Margaret stood, her shadow tall on the wall. "Yes, I do." The thaw. At dawn, the roads cleared. Lila lingered at the door. "I won't publish anything, but—" "Secrets are heavy, Ms. Whitaker." Margaret watched her leave. In her pocket, she fingered Daniel's final letter, found after his death last year. "I never loved her. I was scared you'd see how broken I was." She'd burned it, but the words lingered. That spring, Cedar Hollow noticed changes. Margaret began nodding at Mrs. Porter's bakery. She donated James's medals to the Veterans Hall. And when Father O'Brien came knocking, she handed him a check for the food bank. No explanation, no sermon. But when Lila returned, asking, "Will you tell me more?" Margaret simply smiled. No. Some questions, she'd decided, were not locks to be picked. They were walls, not to isolate, but to say, "Here, I choose what remains." Word count, 998. Theme. The story explores the tension between self-preservation and connection, suggesting that boundaries in old age aren't about bitterness, but about curating one's peace. Margaret's coldness isn't emptiness. It's the quiet armor of a woman who's learned that not all wounds need air to heal.